The train rattled through the dense forest, its wheels screeching against the rusted tracks. The landscape outside was a blur of green and brown, the trees so thick that sunlight barely pierced through. Clara adjusted her camera bag on her lap, her fingers nervously drumming against the leather. She had been traveling for hours, and the air inside the compartment was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else she couldn't quite place, something earthy, almost metallic. The village of Black Hollow was not on any modern map. Clara had stumbled upon it while researching obscure rural traditions for her journalism piece. The Harvest Festival, as it was called, was shrouded in mystery. The few accounts she found spoke of a celebration that dated back centuries, a ritual to ensure a bountiful harvest. But there were whispers too, dark, unsettling whispers, of sacrifices made to appease the old gods. Clara's editor had been skeptical. Human sacrifice? In this day and age? Come on, Clara, it's probably just some overblown folklore. But Clara had a nose for stories, and this one reeked of something deeper, something darker. She had to see it for herself. The train screeched to a halt at a desolate station, the sign barely legible, Black Hollow. Clara stepped onto the platform, her boots crunching against the gravel. The air was colder here, and a faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around her ankles. She pulled her coat tighter and glanced around. The station was empty, the ticket booth boarded up. A single lantern hung from a rusted hook, its flickering light casting long shadows. "Miss Clara," a voice called out, startling her. She turned to see a man standing at the edge of the platform. He was tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, a patchwork of rough fabrics that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. "Yes, that's me," Clara said, forcing a smile. "I'm Elias," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll take you to the village." Clara followed him to a horse-drawn cart, its wooden wheels creaking as they rolled over the uneven ground. The forest closed in around them as they left the station behind, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The mist thickened, and Clara could barely see more than a few feet ahead. "How far is the village?" she asked, trying to break the silence. "Not far," Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the road. "But the forest has a way of playing tricks on you. Best not to wander off." Clara nodded, though his words sent a chill down her spine. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down her observations. The forest, the mist, the eerie silence, it was all perfect for setting the scene in her article. After what felt like an eternity, the cart emerged from the forest into a clearing. The village of Black Hollow lay before them, a cluster of weathered wooden houses with thatched roofs. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint sound of laughter and music drifted through the air. But there was something off about it, something that made Clara's skin crawl. Elias brought the cart to a stop in the center of the village, where a group of villagers had gathered. They were dressed in simple, rustic clothing, their faces weathered and lined with age. They watched Clara with curious eyes, their expressions unreadable. "Welcome to Black Hollow," Elias said, helping her down from the cart. "The festival begins at sundown. You'll want to rest until then." Clara nodded, though she had no intention of resting. She needed to explore, to talk to the villagers, to uncover the truth behind the festival. She thanked Elias and made her way to the inn, a small, ramshackle building at the edge of the village. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a stern face, showed her to a room on the second floor. The room was sparse, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small window that looked out over the village square. Clara set her bag down and peered out the window. The villagers were busy setting up for the festival, hanging lanterns and arranging tables laden with food. But there was something else, a large wooden platform in the center of the square, surrounded by torches. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Was that where the sacrifice would take place? She grabbed her camera and notebook and headed back downstairs. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, so Clara slipped out the front door and into the village square. The villagers paid her no mind as she wandered among them, snapping photos and jotting down notes. She tried to strike up conversations, but they were tight-lipped, their answers vague and evasive. "Excuse me," Clara said, approaching an elderly woman who was arranging flowers on one of the tables. "Can you tell me more about the festival?" The woman looked up, her eyes narrowing. "It's an old tradition," she said curtly. "We give thanks for the harvest." "And the sacrifice?" Clara pressed. "Is it true that?" The woman's expression darkened, and she turned away without another word. Clara sighed in frustration. She was getting nowhere. As the sun began to set, the villagers gathered in the square, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the torches. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and the sound of a fiddle playing a haunting melody. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her camera at the ready. Elias appeared on the wooden platform, his arms raised to silence the crowd. "Welcome, friends," he said, his voice carrying over the square. "Tonight, we give thanks for the bounty of the land. But first, we must honor the old gods." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Elias. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as two villagers dragged a figure onto the platform. It was a young man, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He struggled against his captors, but they held him fast. Clara's stomach churned. This was it, the sacrifice. She raised her camera, her hands trembling as she focused on the scene. She had to document this, had to expose the truth. Elias raised a knife, its blade glinting in the torchlight. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the young man's ragged breaths. Clara's finger hovered over the shutter button, her mind racing. Should she intervene? Could she? Before she could decide, Elias brought the knife down. Clara closed her eyes, unable to watch. But instead of the sickening sound of metal meeting flesh, she heard a loud thud. She opened her eyes to see the young man lying on the platform, his body limp. Elias stood over him, the knife still in his hand. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. It had been a mock sacrifice, a reenactment of the old tradition. She lowered her camera, her hands still shaking. But as the villagers began to disperse, Clara noticed something strange. The young man's body was still on the platform, unmoving. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she saw the blood pooling beneath him, seeping into the wooden planks. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no reenactment. The sacrifice had been real. Clara stumbled back, her mind reeling. She had to get out of here, had to tell someone what she had seen. But as she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with Elias. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice cold and menacing. Clara's heart raced as she tried to push past him, but he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "But now that you have, you'll make a fine offering for next year's festival." Clara's scream echoed through the village square, but no one came to her aid. The villagers watched in silence as Elias dragged her away, their faces devoid of emotion. The harvest festival had claimed another victim, and Clara knew she would never escape the horrors of Black Hollow. The next morning, the village was quiet, the square empty save for the wooden platform, now stained with blood. The villagers went about their daily lives as if nothing had happened, their faces blank and unreadable. The harvest festival was over, and the old gods had been appeased. But deep in the forest, a single lantern flickered, its light casting long shadows over the trees. And somewhere, in the darkness, Clara's camera lay abandoned, its lens cracked and its film exposed. The truth of Black Hollow would remain hidden, buried beneath the weight of tradition and fear. And so, the village waited, biding its time until the next harvest festival, when the old gods would demand another sacrifice. And another. And another. The cycle would continue, as it had for centuries, and the horrors of Black Hollow would remain a secret, known only to those who dared to venture into its depths and never returned.